learned how to do that. And it turned out when I was in college, I went to the University of Colorado Boulder, having those skills allowed me to get jobs that other people couldn't get. And I got basically a student assistant job at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, working for their atmospheric chemistry division. And my job was to write computer code to take old computer media. I'm sure there's some of you in here that remember the big reels of tape that they would use, and I transferred them over to the exabyte cartridges. Anyway, I got to be in the room with the world's leading scientists who studied atmospheric chemistry. And this was the time of the ozone hole. It's before climate change. It's in the 1980s. And I remember sitting there with these scientists, hearing them say things, you know, if only those damn politicians understood science, the world would be a much better place. And I thought, okay, I got a career I got to think about. I can't just plow ahead and become a scientist like my dad. I got to learn something about this policy stuff they're talking about. So I decided to get a master's degree in public policy before returning to physical sciences. Along the way, my mentor had been on the chief of staff of the House Science Committee. After the space shuttle exploded, he felt like Congress was pushing NASA too hard. So he came to Colorado to become a professor. They called him back and said, we want you to be chief of staff for the whole committee. So he went back and he brought me. I think he felt guilty leaving me behind. And he said, just come with me to every meeting, carry my briefcase, act like you belong, and just listen and learn. And I was there, and I remember, after one hearing, and the staff the congressional staff is impressive people, but the science committee in particular, a lot of PhDs in oceanography and other areas. And I remember after one hearing, I think a Nobel Prize winner was testifying, the staff were making fun of the scientists. And they said, oh, if only these damn scientists understood politics, the world would be a much better place. And I thought, okay, here we go. The scientists think politicians don't understand the science, and the people who work in policy don't think the scientists understand policy. That's where I want to be. So I never went back to the physical sciences. I got a PhD in science and technology policy. My first job after my PhD was at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, where I had worked as a student assistant. I was hired as a scientist. And one of the things I realized, I'm in a community of scholars who study this messy interface between science and politics. And I realized what we do is we write these very esoteric articles and publish them in obscure journals that nobody reads, saying how science and policy should be better connected. So at some point I thought, I should write a book that's like a field guide for experts. Don't have to be scientists, any type of experts, who want to understand policy and politics. And that's what became my book, The Honest Broker. And in it, I try to just very simply categorize the different roles that we experts can play when we engage with decision makers. They could be in the private sector, in the public sector, could be elected officials, staff. One of those roles is what I call the pure scientist. The pure scientist is someone who doesn't want anything to do with politics. Put me on an island, give me some research money, a laboratory, I'll just do my research. There's not too many pure scientists out there. Sometimes policymakers want answers to questions. They want to know how many manatees are in the ocean, how many people have COVID, what's the risk of an asteroid striking. And we impanel expert advisory bodies, and I call that in the book science arbitration, where there's a very clear question posed by decision makers that can be answered with the tools of science. Another role, a third role, is what I call the issue advocate. And we're all familiar with issue advocates in democracy. It's people who, they know the answer and they want that answer, or they have their candidate and they want their candidate. I define that as reducing the scope of available choice, usually to your preferred outcome. And over my career, I've seen a lot of folks in the science community, and we can talk about this, kind of slip into issue advocacy. The opposite of issue advocacy is honest brokering. An honest broker, everybody today is familiar with an honest broker. If you go to a travel website or an airline website, and you enter in where you want to go, how much you want to pay, what dates you want to leave, and you see what your options are. The honest broker seeks to give you a sense of what your choices are. Sometimes they'll tell you you have choices you didn't even know about. Their job is not to tell you what to do. Imagine if you went to an airline website and you clicked on something and they said, oh, congratulations, you're going to Los Angeles next week at 12 o'clock and it costs $8,000. No, you wouldn't like that. The job of the honest broker is to empower decision makers, not put a thumb on the scale. And so that's where the book came from. And it's a short book. It's not super technical, which maybe helped that it's been read. And I have this Substack, and for those of you who know, Substack is a platform that allows people to write directly for readers. And I named it The Honest Broker, and it's kind of an inside joke because in my book I say none of us as individuals are very well suited to be honest brokers. We all have our biases, we have our specialized expertise. Honest brokering is a group effort. It takes all of us working together. Usually if you want to have experts be honest brokers, you need a committee. You need a group of people with different expertise, different backgrounds, different political leanings. And so I very much view my Substack, which you could talk about as a group effort.
All right, I want to move to the title, which is The Politicization of Science. And if I were to throw out a claim, that it is getting worse, and we don't like it, and it's bad for democracy, I think almost everybody in this audience would agree to that. And yet, if I were to ask what exactly is bad politicization of science, the answers may start to vary very considerably depending upon where your politics are. And so, there's that adage of, former Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, his definition of obscenity, I know it when I see it. I think this lends itself to a question for you, Roger. What is bad for many folks, it is very clearly when the scientific process is corrupted, overt distortion, manipulation for a political agenda. A lot of other folks think that the scientists themselves are becoming too political in a way that's compromising the scientific work that they're doing. And so, for you, Roger, how do we identify behavior that is politicized and has a negative impact on how we should be connecting science to policy?
Yeah, it's a great question. I want to start first by defending politics. Politics, so in my courses, I define politics as bargaining, negotiation, and compromise in pursuit of shared objectives. And that's a very value-laden type of politics associated with small d democratic politics like we practice in the United States. There's politics of force. People in different places around the world impose their will with guns and bombs. We don't do that here. But we need politics to get along, to get done the business of society. And science is the systematic pursuit of knowledge. And I have a big tent for what I call science. Social scientists, humanists, farmers. They might not have an advanced degree, but they sure do know an awful lot about the work that they do. So science is also a big tent. We want to use science in politics. We want to combine them. We want to mix them up. We want science to be politicized. And so I distinguish between a healthy, constructive politicization of science and what we might call a pathological politicization of science. All of us need reliable information. Either we need it, or if we want the lights to come on, we want our airplanes not to fall out of the sky, we want to make all these wonderful goods that we all have. We need science, and we need it to be integrated with our decision making. One of the trends, and I talk about this in my book, which is it's getting to be close to 20 years old, is that a lot of experts, a lot of scientists, a lot of professors have decided to use that expertise as a means of politics, as a means of bargaining, negotiating, and compromising. You should listen to me because I'm an expert. I'm going to sign a petition for this presidential candidate or that presidential candidate. We've seen a trend towards more issue advocacy and less honest brokering. Honest brokering is difficult in the best of circumstances. I've had scientists who say to me, if I serve as an honest broker, if I give politicians choices, they might make the wrong choice, according to what I think it is. We do need people in society to step back from politics and offer options to policymakers. That serves democracy. One of the challenges I see, I mean, we live in a very polarized time, is that we have come to view that the world is, not black and white, but red and blue. And one of the things that good policy work can do is find areas of compromise, where there are places where people can agree. And maybe tonight we'll talk about energy policy. I do a lot of work on energy policy. We did a survey, Rui Teixeira and I at the American Enterprise Institute, right before the election last year on energy and climate policy. And we had one question in this giant survey, you can read our 28 pages of crosstabs, where everybody agreed. We had a majority of support from every demographic, every income level, education level, every age, and it was on the idea of an all-of-the-above energy policy. And all of the above doesn't mean everything everywhere all the time. It means that if we're going to have a smart energy policy, we have to recognize there are some places where solar makes a lot of sense, like Arizona, some places where wind makes a lot of sense, like West Texas, some places where nuclear makes a lot of sense, Georgia, and so on. And if I'm advising a politician, Democrat or Republican, where should you start in framing how you think about energy policy? Why not start with an all-of-the-above energy policy? You're more likely to, at least initially, avoid that partisan split that we have on topics. And I think that's a good example of what we see across a lot of areas. You've probably all heard about the 70% or the 80% issues. There's a lot more stuff that a lot of people agree on in this country that we could center in our politics rather than centering the things we disagree about.
There's some follow-ups I might come back to, just in terms of, I think bias ticks people off. There's a technical dimension to bias, but there's also what you choose to focus on, what you don't. And then I think we're living in an age of narrative and meta-narrative. And so if somebody's science, even though it might be accurate, is inconvenient for one of the narratives, then politics kicks in. And strong-handed attempts to delegitimize the messenger. We see that. I'll just leave that there. I want to kind of get into the weeds just a little bit. Yeah. And so, Roger, I think you were, you earned your chops, I think, looking at damage data. Pretty diverse in some of the science policy stuff. You wrote the Honest Broker book. I think you were called to testify a few times. You typically early on by the Democrats. Then something happened in 2013. And so you gave some testimony that shot down, I think, that we were seeing climate signals in damage data. And John Holdren, the science advisor for President Obama, testified about a month or two later. The Republicans in Congress were very quick to point out that his testimony seems at odds with your testimony. And then it all blew up and went sideways. And after that, things changed a little bit. Walk us through what happened from your perspective, and then I might have a couple of follow-up questions on not the personalized back and forth, but more so some of the issues that I don't think quite got as much exposure as they should have. Yeah.
So how much time do you guys have? So one of the things I did when I was working at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, my first job, I was on a project looking at hurricanes and floods, and I did a big case study on Hurricane Andrew. And spent a lot of time in Miami, did a lot of research, wrote a report, eventually wrote a book with my dad titled Hurricanes. And one of the studies that I did eventually with a guy named Chris Landsea, Land C. He works at the National Hurricane Center, perfect name. He was a postdoc at Colorado State up the road. We played basketball together, and we used to write papers running up and down the court, talking to each other. One of the studies we did was we asked, what would happen if hurricanes of the past hit with today's population, today's building, and today's wealth? How much economic damage would they cause? And we published the first study on that. A funny little anecdote. After that study came out, it got a lot of attention in reinsurance and insurance. And we were contacted by the state of Florida. And I think it was the insurance commissioner. And they said, could you redo your study just for hurricanes that hit Florida? And we redid it, and we wrote them a report. And it said, we think that the average annual loss in Florida is about 3 times higher than you officially say it is, which would imply, for all you guys, higher insurance rates. They didn't call us back. So that work got a lot of attention, and we did a lot of work teasing out. And one thing to say, once we adjusted for all the more people and more property, there's no trend. Just like there's no trend in hurricane landfalls in the US. And I started getting a lot of attention, and I got some awards for that. And I remember when things changed. It changed in May 2006, when Al Gore's movie came out, An Inconvenient Truth. And if you saw it, if you remember it, it had Hurricane Katrina, which was 2005, at the center of that movie. And the climate advocacy community really shifted at that point to wanting to bring climate change home to normal people as a tool of advocacy. And extreme weather was the way to do that. And so I went pretty instantaneously from being celebrated as a young scholar in my field to somebody who's a bad guy on the wrong side, because our work showed that if you really care about damage, maybe there's some small trends in storms, but it's where we build, what we build, how much wealth we have. All right, flash forward. 2013, and I'm lucky, I'm privileged, I get to testify before Congress. I just testified last month, and it's a really special opportunity. I did used to get invited by Democrats exclusively. Now I'm invited by Republicans exclusively, and I say the same stuff, which is itself kind of interesting. 2013, all right, I testified. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, many of you will have heard of that. They had just published a report called the Special Report on Extreme Events, SREX. And I was invited by Congress, since I was an expert in this area, to testify. What does this report say? It's like 1,000 pages. Can you come testify on it? And I testified, and most people are surprised, and it still is true today. There are increases in heat waves. There are increases in extreme precipitation. There's not in tropical cyclones or hurricanes, not in flooding, not in drought, not in most of the headline issues that people think we've seen trends in. So I gave my little 5-minute prepared remarks, as you do when you testify before Congress. For whatever reason, I will never know the reason why, it went viral. In 2 weeks, it had 400,000 hits on YouTube. And people took notice, and they saw me. And as Frank said, a couple months later, John Holdren from Harvard, President Obama's science advisor at the time, testified before the same committee. And it was actually Jeff Sessions from Alabama, said, Dr. Holdren, I'm not going to try the accent, said, Dr. Holdren, your testimony is at odds with what we heard the IPCC says. It wasn't just me, it was IPCC. It was the authoritative scientific assessment. And I think it really made him mad, because he went back to the White House and wrote up a 6-page, I call it a screed, posted it on the White House website about me. And think about like what your craziest uncle writes and puts on Facebook. It was like that. But the White House is a bully pulpit. And there was a lot of attention focused on me at that time. And we get into the details, but not long after, maybe about 10 months later, my university got a letter from Representative Raul Grijalva from New Mexico, recently passed away. His daughter was just elected to fill a seat. Wrote a letter to my university, said, we'd like you to investigate Professor Pelkey. Because he is at odds with science advisor John Holdren, we think Professor Pelkey has taken money under the table from ExxonMobil. My Ferrari, it does say XXO on You know, I didn't take any money. I was investigated. But, you know, that was career-changing, life-changing sort of thing. I would put that in the category of pathological politicization of science. But that's the sort of thing. And, you know, I came to realize we study policy, we debate policy, we discuss policy to have effect, have impact. People understand what the world is like. We don't always prepare people for the consequences of succeeding. And, you know, things turned out great. I mean, look, I'm on a stage talking about my work, but you know, we could talk as much detail as any of you guys want. You can ask questions, but it was an interesting time, and eventually, you know, it was a slow motion departure, but I left the University of Colorado at the end of last year, really based on the events that started a decade ago.
I have one quick follow-up
Yeah.
in the weeds for those that follow some of the back and forth closely, because it's not gone away. Debates over extreme weather events and attribution. And then just foreshadowing, I'm going to talk a little bit or ask a question about the working group, or the administration essentially let go of folks that do our national climate assessment, the scientists. There were energy department put forward a reassessment. I want to ask a question about that, and then we'll get to COVID, because actually Roger is leading a project that's doing a lot of lessons learned about the science project policy there. Coming back to the extreme weather and the ongoing debate about whether there are actually trends or detections. Carefully have read, again, ongoing blogs, critiques of your position, your critiques of their position. There's certainly lots of things that are happening in terms of what in the bowels the lower working groups say, and then how that gets translated into executive. But there are three things that I think just got lost in the debate, and I just want your reaction. I didn't,
Sure.
you know, and one or two of them you acknowledge in forefront, the other one a little less so. And so the first one is, you definitely, I think, have made the point, but it hasn't stuck, and that is, if there is a system that produces outcomes of interest, again, droughts, intense hurricanes, heat waves, that we care about, if it is a system of anything that we care about that has a high level of stochasticity, variance, noise, you just get a lot of swings. If you do have a lot of noise in a system, the evidentiary demands in the logic of statistics in order to detect a signal are going to go up. And that's going to be actually compounded by the length of a data set. And so if we care about the probability of extreme weather events and we fixate too much on detecting a signal, we need to keep in mind that in systems with lots of variance, the demands are quite high. It's going to take some time before you can definitively say with 95%, when in fact, yes, the probability of certain weather events might be increasing. You just cannot, again, confirm that with a high degree of statistical confidence. If you have a system that's pretty much consistent with not a lot of noise in it, then it's a lot easier to do that. That's the first point. The second one, I think, is one that in the rejoinder, I do think it's an important point, and it's one that I got hammered into my head. If we're investigating causal claims, that climate forcing, because of global warming, is causing, we think that they're going to cause more extreme weather events. Certainly we could do some statistical correlation tests and analyses of time series, but it's really important to specify the mechanisms that we think are going to be operating that will get us. So why would there be more trials? How is it going to work? In terms of hurricanes, why might there be more or more intense hurricanes? What are the specific mechanisms that actually would produce that? And then go see if they're actually operating the way that we think that they are. And if they are operating and you're not seeing any statistical connection, why is that? Is it more of a statistical artifact, or is it there's something that's counteracting it? I think, again, investigating the mechanisms are really important. Not to just fixate, again, on the statistical connection. That kind of just got lost, I think. And then the last one is a point that I think you're familiar with. is when we're talking about changes in the patterns of these extreme weather events, really regional is, you could have certain areas that are vulnerable to drought that are becoming less vulnerable. We're seeing less drought. Other areas you might be seeing more drought. Guess what? Your global average is going to, if you use sort of a global perspective, they cancel each other out. No changes. When in fact there might be some really important changes. And so a really cautionary point in terms of, let's look at different regions. And if you're seeing something that's happening in one region and not another region on extreme weather, I want to know why. It's very interesting. And getting back to that second point on the mechanisms, what's muting them in one area versus another. So it's just, my question is just to react to, I found it, and somebody in terms of looking back and forth at a lot of the literature, what should the public know and understand? I don't think they understand these things, and I think it just gets lost with a lot of the, the back and forth.
I wrote a book in 2010 called The Climate Fix, and the first chapter is called Dinner Table Climate Science. And it's about learning about atmospheric science from my dad growing up. Climate change is real. Humans affect the climate system. Greenhouse gases have an effect that warms the planet, and that affects weather systems. And there's no doubt about it. People can argue, well, I think it's going to be super bad, or I think it's not going to be bad. But yes, there are effects. The problem, as I see it, with hooking your political wagon to extreme weather. I mean, extreme weather is fantastic. It happens somewhere in the world every day. Just today,
Jamaica's not having a good day.
Today, as I was preparing, I was watching Hurricane Melissa, which is, made landfall over western Jamaica, and hope that they come out okay. And I was watching CNN, and it was a constant discussion of, well, this is climate change, this is climate change. And they said, this is the most powerful storm on the planet this year so far. That is absolutely true. It is the most powerful storm on the planet. Why is it the most powerful storm on the planet? One reason is the western North Pacific, so think the Philippines, think Hong Kong, think Japan, is the most active basin for tropical cyclones on the planet. They are well below average and have had very few powerful storms. The Pacific Ocean, as everybody knows, is a little bit bigger than the Caribbean and has much more powerful storms. And so yes, it's the most powerful storm, but it's the most powerful storm because storm activity is well below average on planet Earth this year. What happens, if you're in insurance or reinsurance or you're doing building codes for Florida, yeah, you got to get the actuarial science, answer all these questions in detail. But for normal people, most normal people, the minute you find out that it's either the media or the campaigning climate scientist that is trying to pull a fast one over you, trust is compromised at that point. And so what I tell my colleagues is just call it straight. That hurricanes have not increased on planet Earth, in the Atlantic, landfalling in the United States for the period of record that we have. That's just the data. Don't even believe me. Go look up the data. Go look at the IPCC. And if that's inconvenient for somebody's politics, I mean, tough beans. There's a lot of good reasons for improving our energy policies. We could talk about that. But reducing extreme weather is not one of those reasons. And that's just what the evidence says.
Yeah, I'm going to turn attention quick to the sort of maybe not so inside baseball. It's certainly on climate policy relevant. Roger has talked about the IPCC assessments. There have been 6 of them. They're in the process of doing the 7th. They come out every few years. We here in the United States do a national climate assessment. It's congressionally mandated. We've had, I think, I'm not sure what the number is. You can tell me how many we've had. But we're in the process of working on the next one. The new administration essentially disbanded. They weren't paid, but the scientists, how many of them? 80 of them were working on it or something on those. And then our energy secretary, Chris Wright, tasked 5 scientists to reassess our climate science, sort of in lieu of, I'm not sure what's going to happen with the national climate assessment, but All of these 5 scientists are distinguished, credentialed scientists. All 5 of them are viewed by what, the boundaries of the mainstream climate community as skeptical for one degree or another. I would caution against broad brushes against any collection, but especially these 5. They're different in terms of their areas of expertise. So they put out a reassessment and heavily criticized by mainstream science, got a little snarky again. At the same time, we should not be naive with respect to the administration would like to roll back an endangerment finding through the EPA, which would allow them, again, to do get rid of a lot of regulation, essentially, if greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide is no longer considered dangerous. And in looking at the report, I want you to give me your take on what the 5 of them did, and then again, the reaction on the part of the mainstream community, whether that was helpful or not. It might have been an overreaction. There might be some things that they did that were helpful that just got lost in the crossfire. But at the same time, if you look at what is emphasized and how it's framed, it looks like it's deliberately sort of positioning the EPA to roll back its endangerment fire. So for me, that's politicized science.
Yeah, if I could have my PowerPoint projector. No, I know too much about this. In 1994, I did my PhD dissertation on the legislation that created the National Climate Assessment. And if you told me 30 years later I'd be talking about the work I did in my dissertation, again, I would have laughed really hard. So when Congress created the US National Climate Assessment, and assessing science is really important. We'll probably come back to this when we talk about COVID. On climate, literally there are tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of peer-reviewed academic scientific papers published every year. None of us can read even a sliver of those. If you want to know what's up, I mean, there's probably 5,000 papers on hurricanes. If you want to know and no one paper is definitive on any topic. So if you want to know what's the literature say, what's the research say, you have to assess the science. So the idea behind creating a US National Climate Assessment is right. It makes a lot of sense. But Congress, in its wisdom, back in 1990, introduced a design flaw in the National Climate Assessment. It placed it in the White House. What could go wrong? The National Climate Assessment since then has been overseen by political appointees of both parties. And when Democrats are in office, they put their thumb on the scale. And when Republicans are in the office, they put their thumbs on the scale. And we all suffer because we get an assessment that's not a fair assessment of the science, but an assessment that's framed in ways that the administration that's in power thinks is going to advance their political interest. That's not that's pathological politicization of science. So, and we've had, when Trump first came in, he got rid of the people doing the climate assessment because he wanted his people doing it. Then Biden came in and got rid of Trump's people and put his people in, and they did their version. And now, we're back, and we have this funny seesaw. The Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, he's a Colorado guy. I know him pretty well. I knew him before he was Secretary of Energy. Maybe they're listening. He's a good guy. He's a smart guy. He did go to the wrong high school in Colorado, but I don't fault him for that. And I do think that this effort of this kind of parallel climate report was basically his pet project. There has been discussion that because the assessment process in the United States in particular has been captured by interest, one way or the other, we need to impanel what's called a red team. So in the military, they have a blue team and a red team, and the red team is supposed to find what are the problems with the argument by the blue team. It's supposed to be a competitive way to assess knowledge or policy options. I'm not a big fan of it. But he impaneled this group to try to open up discussions of climate science. And I think the intent is perfectly fine. The execution maybe wasn't so great. They published their report. My work is cited in there, and I've written, it's cited accurately. None of the criticisms of the report focus on my work, which extreme weather, climate scenarios. Part of the reason I think people criticize so loudly is so you will not pay attention to the stuff that's accurate in there. Immediately after, the US National Academy of Sciences, which is a prestigious body that elects scientists to be in their members, they said, we're going to do a rapid turnaround report. And they did their report. And guess what? Between the two reports, they do not cite any of the same papers or literature. Completely separate universes. And so for me, that's a sign that something is deeply broken. And what I would prefer is, all right, let's get those 5 scientists who did this report, let's get those other scientists and lock them in a room and say, figure it out. And if you can't agree on something, tell us that. Tell us where you don't agree, and then give that information to the public and to policymakers. And guess what? We're smart enough. We can figure it out from there. And there's a lot of uncertainties in climate, and we can talk about some of them. At the same time, climate change is real. I did an event in Washington at AEI on the EPA endangerment finding. It's not important if you know the technical details. It's basically the basis for federal regulation of emissions from cars and trucks and power plants. I said that this new DOE report, the one with the 5 alternate scientists, had sufficient information on the reality of climate change to support EPA anyway. So I don't know why the climate advocacy community didn't say, oh, thank you very much. That supports what we want to do anyway, even though there's small differences over this, that, or the other thing. So the assessment process for climate in the United States is deeply, deeply broken. And I talk to people all over the country, and when people say, I don't know what's what, I don't know what I should believe, part of the reason for that is that the expert community has failed. We could talk about the media. The media just makes everything worse. But it is perfectly reasonable for a normal person to say, I don't know what's what on this topic. And it's fair.
2 of the points that you make that I would underscore, and you've written about this a little bit, over the last decade or 2, just the volume of science directed at climate change has grown exponentially, which is very challenging for those that are conducting an assessment. And so what you choose to focus on and highlight is loaded in terms of the choices. The cherry picking accurate view of where the science is. And then there's the framing part too, which is hard to get away from. I mean, if it's relevant, it's going to probably serve one narrative as opposed to another. But at the same time, I just see it on both sides, just going out of their way to frame things in a very, very loaded way.
Let me give you an example. So I talked about the IPCC and its SRX report that didn't find significant trends in a lot of events. There's been a lot of frustration in the climate advocacy community that mainstream climate science hasn't really supported these narratives of dramatic increases in extreme weather. And so some advocacy groups, Climate Central is one of them.
Wait a second, they just died.
I guess I've been cut.
There you go.
They decided they were going to create a new area of science called extreme event attribution. And they were going to do this in a way that they circumvented the peer-reviewed process. So science goes through peer review. It's published in scientific journals. They were just going to issue press releases.
Again,
What's happening?
I don't know.
All right, I've been cut off. Comes back occasionally. They were just going to do press releases. So you've all seen it. Every time there's an extreme event, you will see a headline in the newspaper. The flood, the tragic flood in Texas that killed all those kids. Horrible, horrible event. You will see a headline. Climate change made this event 40 times more likely, 75% more likely. None of that stuff appears in the scientific literature. It's entirely a creation of interest groups trying to focus attention on this particular topic. And all it does is breed cynicism and distrust.
All right, I want to take 5 minutes, turn to COVID,
Yep.
and then we'll get questions from the audience. And so this is more open-ended. You're leading a project called Escape. Tell us a little bit about that project and what are some of the sort of the insights thus far in terms of, I don't think, yes, the communication of the science of COVID-19 and rolling that into public health advice went horribly wrong in the country. And however that you want to look at it, 1 million people died and everybody was angry at each other. And there was, you couldn't say anything about COVID that didn't have some kind of political stigma attached to it. So that one didn't go very well. What's your project? What does it has to offer?
Yeah, so the project's concluded. It was a fun project. It was evaluation of science advice in a pandemic emergency, ESCAPE. I think it was funded by the National Science Foundation because we had a very clever acronym. But what it was a comparative analysis of how different countries around the world organize their experts to provide advice during the first 2 years of the pandemic. And there's a lot of flavors of how countries around the world organize their experts. A unique aspect about the United States of America is that we had no high-level scientific advisory body on COVID. So you'll remember the Trump administration had their coronavirus task force. That was not an expert advisory committee. That was comprised entirely of political appointees and one non-political appointee, Tony Fauci, who later became a political appointee under Joe Biden. A science advisory body is not there because they speak the truth. They have all the answers. They give us a baseline against which normal people can evaluate their claims and counterclaims. So what happened was, in this country, we had an incredible tapestry of scientific advisory bodies. Florida has its, Colorado has its one, my university had one, New College probably had one also, and they were at the county level. And so what people could do is they could go expert shopping. And you could say, well, you know, I really don't like the advice I'm getting from the state of Colorado, but Arkansas has a really interesting set of advice. And that's not how it's supposed to work. I mean, literally, if you tell me what answer you want for a particular scientific topic, I can probably find you an expert. But that doesn't mean that it's connected to the real world. And so one of the failures in the US, and I give a lot of credit to George W. Bush, because apparently he was on a beach vacation and had a book about the pandemic, Spanish flu 100 years ago, and it really got him motivated to try to get the US government organized for pandemics, and did a lot of the groundwork that was in place when COVID started. But one of the things that wasn't done was thinking about how we organize our experts. Then we come to learn, years later, that, for example, Tony Fauci said, well, we said people didn't need masks because we wanted to make sure there was enough for healthcare workers. Well, that's not a particularly scientific justification. Or we learned that there wasn't a lot of evidence for the effects of shutting down schools or distancing. And so the lack of formal mechanisms of robust assessment that say what they say, and you know, you or I can like it or not, but that was a huge failure for the US. Now, the US National Academy of Sciences and the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House organized an effort in the first months of the pandemic to provide rapid response reports. President Trump's science advisor in the first term was a guy named Kelvin Drogemeyer. He's a meteorologist. He was at the University of Oklahoma. I've known him for 20 years because he's in the atmospheric sciences. I did an interview with him, one of the only people who's interviewed him since he's been in office, and I tried to push him on this point. But basically what happened was the Trump administration squelched, silenced this effort, which was comprised of actual legitimate experts, in favor of the coronavirus task force. And everybody probably remembers there was the daily press conference. Donald Trump was up there, and you had Deborah Birx and Anthony Fauci. But the COVID experience, I think, did more to harm trust in science, really across the board, but it also fed into this partisan split. I don't know if we're going to talk about universities also, but there is a huge problem in this country is that a lot of expert institutions, including universities, have leaned to the left. No big surprise there. And that has helped feed into distrust of experts across the board, which is a problem because we all need experts, not just experts from one side or the other.
Yes, the trust issue, I think, is underpinning just about everything that we're talking about. And you're talking a little bit about sort of the mess that our institutional situation is on these public health or pandemic crises and the need to reform that. The one thing that just for me I found frustrating, and there was, again, I felt bad in part for the scientists that, you don't get these types of pandemics like once a century, and the pathogen profile was super, confounding when it comes to the implications for public health advice. Incubation period that's somewhere between 2 and 14 days. Transmission is extremely important, whether it's by contact, droplet, or aerosolized. Didn't realize until a little on that it's aerosolized. It's much more contagious. That just creates a lot of, again, confounding factors to consider and weigh. Asymptomatic carriers, you had a large number of people that were carrying that just were not showing any symptoms. And then asymmetric vulnerability in our population. People that, some people were fine and not very vulnerable. As a large statistical group, others a lot more vulnerable. The public health advice to draw from that, it ain't easy. And I think the posture was not to confuse people and sort of open up the door to the uncertainty and the things they were struggling with, but rather than to just, this is what the policy is, follow it. You got questions that turned into the vilification of and then society vilified those that, resisted, and it just blew up, and it was a mess.
Well, one of the things we found in our study, and this was not just the US, but across the board, is that where there were expert advisory groups put together, they were almost exclusively comprised of public health officials. You didn't have economists. So a big issue, this was a big issue in the UK, they found in their look back at the pandemic. And a big issue here is what are the consequences for people of shutting down the economy when a lot of people need to be outside the home, working in restaurants, working with other people. Those have effects too. With school children, there are profound negative consequences to keeping kids out of school. If all you do is focus on the public health aspects and we want to maximize this one variable, you're going to get bad advice. And so the time to think about, well, what sort of experts do we want around the table when the pandemic comes is probably now. It was probably 20 years ago, but before the pandemic happens, because we got really torqued into a very narrow disciplinary focus on what mattered at that time.
I'm going to open it up to questions. Roger and I could probably talk for another hour, but we want the audience engaged. So,
yes, before we get into Q&A, please, round of applause for everything. Thank you. And so we have two of my wonderful interns here in the comms department. You guys can make a line on either side where they're going to be doing the Q&A. You guys can come ask questions, anything for Frank and Roger here. Don't be shy, please. And while you guys line up to do some of the Q&A, I have a couple of announcements. First, if you enjoyed what you have seen tonight, enjoyed the other events that we've done, and the other ones that we have coming up, some huge events, which you guys have seen on our flyer up there, please don't forget to get involved with New College of Florida, with our foundation. We have cards up there and all sorts of the information that you need. And our next event is November 12th, which is Rick Doblin, who is a New College alum, and Tom O'Neill, who wrote a book titled Chaos. And that event is called Psychedelics, Healers, and CIA Mind Controllers. So it's going to be a fun one. So we hope to see you there November 12th at 6 p.m. at Sainer. You'll be able to sign up out front. One last thing, as you guys may have heard, we are doing a Charlie Kirk Memorial here on campus, advocating for free speech on our campus. We believe Charlie embodied the values that make a college education what it's supposed to be. He would show up on a college campus and he would tell people to prove me wrong. And that is what we want New College to be about, where all ideas are tested and where all ideas are welcome, no matter how unpopular they are. So we are building a memorial, and we now actually have renderings after talking with the sculptors, and we are hoping to get underway with building it very soon. So we are very excited and just wanted to keep you guys updated on that. So thank you so much for your generous support to make this possible. Now, without further ado, we will do the... Thank you. We got one fan in here. That's great. So without further ado, we will start the Q&A. We'll start on this side. And thank you guys so much.
My name is Laura Hartman. I am a victim advocate, and I was one of the founders of America Frontline Nurses. So my experience during COVID is very different, so I have that awareness. So I'm really going to try to focus my question to the public trust side. And moving forward, what does it look like for nurses to be able to advocate appropriately for patients in the public space without retaliation or threats or doxing or all the above that's happened to us?
Good, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fantastic question, and this is another great example of pathological politicization of science. And this gets to, and I can't speak directly to nursing because it's outside my scope, but I can tell you that we have gotten to a place, I see it in the climate debate, I've seen it in the COVID debate, where it is almost war by other means. And there are some issues for which we don't fight over science. And there has been good research that's done, and what that research shows is that the politicization of science is a choice. It's a choice by our leaders. To take a topic, just recently, fluoride in drinking water has started to become politicized in ways that in my entire lifetime it has not been politicized. Vaccination used to be an issue among concerned mothers on the far left. Boulder County where I live, had the most whooping cough cases during the time my kids were in high school. Things have switched around. There's nothing inherently natural about why issues get politicized the way they do, why the left supports this, the right supports that. That's because of choices. And I mean, this is where in a democracy we all have to do our job. It's real easy, I think, in this populist moment, I don't think anybody has the answer, but for people to see science as a wedge issue in our politics. And I would say science is far too important to be that wedge issue. I mean, do flag burning or something else. Pick another topic people can fight over. Once we start fighting over things like vaccination or the work of nurses, people are gonna die. And there are gonna be really bad outcomes. And guess what? The smartest and most caring of us are not gonna choose to go in these professions because they're just awful. So, like everybody else, I have no answer to that other than to keep raising these issues and to ask the people who are in leadership positions, including elected officials, but especially experts in universities, in government, in business, to push back really hard against the politicization of our expert institutions.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, my name is Bill Woodson. Thanks for an interesting presentation. I'm curious, certainly in the last 10, 20 years, it's gotten, what you call the politicization, the pathological politicization has really escalated. It doesn't seem like the US has a history of really learning from best practices from other countries. And I'm wondering if you have noted in your work best practices, healthier relationships between politics, because to your point, there does need to be a practical understanding of how to leverage the science. Do you see, you have a couple examples of where it's working really well, and do you have a sense of why our country is so resistant to learning from others?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I can draw some from our comparative study. There are some countries that fared much better when it comes to science advice, not necessarily pandemic outcomes. Japan is one of them. Japan had a very high level of trust in experts. One reason for that is, you may recall the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011. That was a disaster for experts. And so there was a real learning within that country about how important it is to have trust in experts, have a broad advisory body. South Korea is another. Norway is another that had very good response. The UK is not. Part of the issue, I think, is the United States is a pretty unique place. It's 360 million people. It's much bigger. Norway is the size of Colorado. It's 5 million people. It's much easier to run things there. We had one of my colleagues as part of our study looked at North Carolina and the pandemic response. North Carolina did pretty good. And it seems that the smaller the unit of governance is, the easier it is. And I don't have a good answer for that. But one thing I do know is that in a country of 360 million people in a populist era, it is really difficult for people to come together. I would just note, if you look at our politics today, and I don't care, I tell my students I don't care who you vote for or what your politics are, but the people who I see on TV and I see when I testify on Capitol Hill, they think doing their job is dividing Americans, not bringing them together. And so long as the leadership does that, I really don't see much learning even possible.
Dr. Ellis.
Yeah. Hi, Dave Ellis, one of Frank's colleagues here at New College. My question is related to the idea of specialization, which you had indicated probably in both, but more on the COVID side. So since systems are interconnected and there's a danger of focusing only in your own specialization in the paradigm. So are you starting to see any movement in the policy community towards transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary configurations? And on my own interest, do you see any introduction of complexity theory as a component in any of these kind of wicked problems?
Yeah, it's a great question. Historically and in general, we do best as a society on questions that require specialized expertise. Science arbitration. How many manatees are there? Well, you can probably go around this state and pick out the 10 people you need on a committee, and you'll do pretty good. One of the things we don't do so good is to distinguish between science advice, how many manatees are there, and policy advice. What should we do with respect to manatee conservation? What are our choices? The latter requires the sort of interdisciplinary, whatever term you want to use, expertise, but also the involvement of civil society and normal people. And we don't do that particularly well, partly because we have a hard time sitting around the table and talking about differences. I don't see much discussion of complexity theory. I see, for example, on the climate change issue, a lot of efforts to, I don't know what the opposite of complexity theory is, but oversimplification, a lot of efforts to try to flatten things out. In politics, we like nice, tidy stories. And the reality, as I'm sure you know really well, is that most systems that are out there are colored by shades of gray. And we can't make great predictions, and we don't understand. Should we raise interest rates, lower interest rates? Economists will debate that. Are tariffs good? Are they bad? And so this is why my focus is much more on how do we build the institutions that can provide the information we need, not on any specialized expertise or what you do or Frank does or what I do. It's the institutions that have atrophied.
One little follow-up, though. One of my personal, I think, criticisms of the scientific establishment is they're relying a little bit too much on a conception of specialized expertise and credentials to the extent that it's very stay in your lane, when in fact, again, if you go back to some of the the most famous scientists over the last couple of centuries, go back a century, very holistic in terms of they don't really need to give airtime to a crackpot that doesn't know what they're talking about. At the same time, the mainstream scientific community, sometimes very quick to try to dismiss or delegitimize voices that may be asking some very, very good questions and see things. They understand, the subject matter fairly well, and they're asking good questions. They just don't have a certain level of And in terms of the folks, many of you are getting your sort of opinions about knowledge and the state of it from influencers that don't have much in the way of credentials at all. And so at the end of the day, I think if we care about trust, and simply play, you're not an expert, according to us, we're the gatekeepers, I just think that's a dangerous, it's an unhelpful tactic or response to.
Thanks. I'm Rowan Loveland. I'm one of the faculty here. I guess following on with what you said, I think that both COVID and the climate stuff have done a lot to really bankrupt the trust in experts. So we've lost a lot of that. But I'm wondering, actually, isn't that kind of a good thing, potentially, given that you mentioned that our universities have really shifted to the left enough, so I think we have a preponderance of experts on one side as opposed to both sides. And so I think there's maybe a silver lining with what's gone on to the extent that experts have been delegitimized, and maybe at this time in history, maybe that's a good thing. So I guess I'm curious about your reaction about that.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing in the sense that the system needs to improve and needs to change, and I'm not sure what would motivate that. There's a long story to tell here, and I promise I won't tell it. But for a long time, there was this idea in this country, a lot of people have written about it, called the social contract for science. The idea that the public will support federal funding for research, universities, because in exchange, universities are going to educate people coming back from World War II. We're going to make good citizens. We're going to do research that leads to new drugs and new technologies. Everybody's going to benefit. And with the end of the Cold War, that social contract kind of got shaken up. So why do we need all this funding for research? Why do we need universities? And over my career, I've noticed that a lot of us experts in universities have decided, we can use these prestigious institutions to advance the politics that we support against our fellow citizens. And a lot of people, Dan Sarowitz among them and others, have written for a long time that the political lean of the people who run universities and inhabit universities is going to be problematic, especially if those people decide they want to go to war against the rest of normal America. And so it's no surprise that there has been this loss of support. Again, there's good polling on this. The loss of trust and support for universities occurs across demographic groups in this country, with the exception of one group: wealthy, white, liberal, highly educated people, the people who are most like how universities are comprised. And so that's a problem, because if we lose trust and expertise, then we're going to have people who attack nurses and refuse to vaccinate their kids when it makes good sense, who want to throw the baby out with the bathwater on climate change. And so the lack of trust is a problem. On the bright side, there are places, New College is one of them, but there are bigger places like Johns Hopkins, UTEP, Auburn, where the leaders of the universities are talking in a different way than they did 5 years ago. And the one thing I say to my colleagues in academia, I would love to see university presidents give speeches where they say, universities serve all Americans, every one of them, whatever religion, whatever politics, wherever they come from, immigrants, non-immigrants, that's what we do. We serve all Americans. And universities got out of that habit, and I can point you to a number of really prominent academics who will go out publicly and say, our job is to eliminate Republicans in this country. Well, what do you think the response is going to be if you go out and say stuff like that? So I do think, I think it's a double-edged sword. Yes, shake things up, but boy, we got to fix things pretty fast.
Thanks. I'm Bruce Abramson. I'm with the data science program here. Can I suggest that the key to restoring trust lies with the policy end of the science and technology policy? That one of the big problems is that people don't understand question framing. And if you look at the climate debate versus COVID, they're radically different questions. The climate debate, The question is, should we impose major structural changes? And if so, which ones? This is thoughtful, it's deliberative, it's taken place over a long time, and that immediately tells you you're looking at public choice theory. So you know that almost every question from a politician to a scientist is of the form, can you provide evidence that will support my preferred course of action? COVID is a panic situation, and the imperative from any politician, and the question they're going to ask is, can you give me a recommendation that will be seen as immediate, highly visible action? Because the one thing I can't do is say, sorry, we don't know enough, just don't panic. And so, again, backing up into looking at the problem framing, you know that what you're looking at ahead of time is a complete obliteration of value of information calculations, cutting across your Bayesian differential diagnosis. You get a premature commitment to something that cannot be justified. And once the politician has taken that position, they must double down on it independent of the evidence. Now, if the public actually understood what the questions going from politicians to scientists were, they wouldn't confuse this with places where scientists are trying to understand the science. And they would know that in any politically charged scientific question, they're not getting informed scientific debate. They're getting framed questions that differ based on what the policy imperative is.
Yeah, let me just say, I mean, I agree with that, and let me just support that by saying, I posted it last week. I forgot which group in Washington did it, but they did a survey of staffers on the Hill, people who work for congressional committees and members of Congress. And they asked, what do you use the science of climate and energy for? And the response, I don't remember the exact number, it was like 80% said, we use it to advocate for positions that we already hold. And we don't use it for insight or to form new policies. And if science becomes a tool of marketing, then we have real problems.
Salutations, gentlemen. My name is Dylan Niner. I'm an alumni from New College. Forgive me for misunderstanding, but under your framework of the honest broker, I feel like there's a logical fallacy there of false equivalency in saying that all theories should be held upright in the light and to be shown. And I agree that all theories are theories and hold water. And I also agree that we shouldn't silence voices in science just because they don't fall lock and step with the dogma at the time. Germ theory was once a theory after it all. But shouldn't we prioritize the things that make sense and have the most evidence behind them instead of just listening to, I don't know, Frank, you said a crackpot just spouting off about something? Shouldn't we give credence to the people who have degrees and hold stuff, have shown to have evidence instead of just going along with whoever agrees with us at the time?
Yeah, I mean, far be it from me to suggest we should listen to crackpots. But what I want to emphasize from that framework, there's a difference between me saying to you, we need to impose a $60 carbon price next week, or saying, here's 27 different policy options, including that one, that you should deliberate and think about and pick the one that makes the most sense to you. Of course, choices have to be made who's around the table. And so think of it as kind of a spectrum. Here's the one option, here's a big group of experts. No, you don't want the crackpots around there. But I do think that our politics when it comes to science advice has overcorrected. I can tell you, I routinely get called a climate denier. I'm one of those people that a lot of folks don't want around the table. I'm pretty happy about my academic CV. It looks pretty good. But we have come to weaponize the idea of being a crackpot. Look at the origins of COVID debate. That started out with immediately tarring anyone who said, well, maybe there's a research-related incident here as they're bigots or they're just nuts. And now the general consensus, really on the left and the right, is, well, that's possible. It's not certain, but it's possible, and we should investigate it. So I think that the errors associated with including a broad spectrum of folks, even if there's somebody who may not know what they're talking about around the table, are diluted if you have a big group of experts. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, last thing I'll say on this, it has hundreds and hundreds of authors. And their job is to show where the center of gravity is in the published literature. If you include these 5 scientists that the Department of Energy had write a report in there, they're probably not going to affect that center of gravity very significantly, but most normal people will say, all right, that must be a healthy process because they have a diversity of views. So I take your point, and I think it's a valid one, but I think in practice, things are a little bit less dire than the crackpot's taken over.
I'll add a little bit
Yeah.
to, the crackpot, I think one of the difficulties, I don't have a clear answer in terms of guidelines, and so I would very much like to see a lot more simply respectful, honest deliberation within the scientific community in order to try to get at the best available knowledge, which may change. You don't want to dig your heels in too much, show a little bit of humility. At the same time, I think there are a shill or a paid hack where somebody has a track record of essentially, they're using rhetorical and other types of tactics to advance an agenda. Pointing that out or making people aware, I wouldn't want you not to do that. And then there are some folks that are just so they're ideological warriors. And they have a track record essentially of, again, even if they're qualified scientists, they have to fit everything into a particular meta-narrative that they're totally bought into. If that's the track record, pointing that out, I think, is fair game. The problem is when you use that to deal that accusation across the board, and there again, people get caught in the crossfire. It's not going to be effective, and it just does harm. And so I think many mainstream climate scientists have used that tactic to, ultimately it's not only not working, it's unhealthy, And a follow-up, Ro, on your point, I think course correction in terms of knowledge institutions was absolutely necessary. At the same time, I worry greatly that we're dismantling and bulldozing the institutions. I'm not talking about particular people because I do think they're very, very important for a democracy. And if nobody trusts any of the knowledge institutions that we have, then it just becomes an anarchic free-for-all. You just self-select into whatever reality you want to. That's not going to be a good situation. So I think I'm of the view that we've way over course corrected. In knowledge institutions in general, not talking, the academic discussion, institutional neutrality. I think we had it on the agenda to talk about. We just didn't have enough time to get there. But these are interesting discussions.
Hi. If I understand you correctly, climate change is real. But did I understand you correctly also that there have been no trends that can be identified with respect to things like hurricanes, flooding, extreme heat, etc.?
Not exactly.
Explain.
Extreme heat, yes, there have been trends, particularly since the 1960s, of more heat waves, very well documented. There are very strong trends in sea level rise, for example, which is going to be familiar to folks in Florida. Strong trends in what's called extreme precipitation. But the IPCC goes out of its way to say, be careful, extreme precipitation is not the same thing as flooding. So globally, there's no detected trends in flooding. Fire weather, so hot and dry conditions, there have been trends in that. Soil moisture deficits, yes, there's been identified trends. I don't even
The one
like,
that we'll talk about after, is not certain the hurricane frequency. I think it's actually confidence that there's but
so
the
there's
intensity part, that's interesting.
well, so the IPCC said there has not been detected trends in tropical cyclones for most measures of frequency or intensity. There are interesting hypotheses out there for which the observational evidence doesn't support it. There is a very strong hypothesis that tropical cyclones, when they make landfall, are going to rain more. There's going to be more precipitation. That's a hypothesis because it hasn't been borne out in observation. There's a lot of talk about, for example, rapid intensification of hurricanes, how fast they become stronger. The data is really mixed on that, and if you look at what the literature says, it's a very interesting hypothesis. So hurricanes, the most interesting feature of U.S. hurricane landfalls in the historical record is the period from 2005 to 2017 when there were no Category 3 or stronger hurricanes that made landfall in the continental United States. Nothing like it in the entire record. I talk to my students, I talk to young people who work in the media, in business, and they say, I used to remember there was no hurricanes. And I said, yeah, that was right. You know, what were you doing in the 1940s or the 1920s? And then we have records, it's called paleotempestology, where you look at dune overflows and so on. And there's an expectation that the Atlantic Ocean is the quietest it's been in the last 300 years. Again, it's a hypothesis. It's going to be hard to verify. But I don't even like the category extreme weather, because you have to go phenomena by phenomena, extreme heat, floods, tropical cyclones, and each one will have its own science, and it will be different.
In terms of politics, does it matter? Apparently what you're saying is that there are some trends that are not identifiable, and there are some trends that are trends that are. Are those good? None of those
So,
trends are
yeah.
good for the general well-being of humans on the planet.
So what I tell people, I mean, if the politics are, how much should you guys pay in your insurance rates? Yeah, those are pretty important. If it is, how fast should we decarbonize the global economy? Probably not too relevant. If I'm going to sell people in China, in India, in Nigeria, in Florida, in Colorado on the mitigation of climate change, I'm going to do it by talking about their pocketbooks and their wallets and saying, guess what? We can come up with energy technologies that are more reliable, less costly, less polluting, and you're going to like them better because they foster American jobs. I'm not going to say, oh, you can prevent this or that extreme event next week, next year, in 500 years, because that's a false promise. And people don't respond to it anyway. But I am a big proponent of nuclear power. I think it is, number one, it's reliable, it is secure, it provides good jobs. I just had this conversation with a class I taught last night. The world is going to consume massive amounts more energy. We in this room are among the lucky 2 billion on this planet. We have access to energy services that there are 6 billion people on this planet they don't have access to. And they want it, and they're going to get it. And they're going to get it by burning coal if they have to, the dirtiest fuel source. So when I talk to people about climate change, climate science is interesting. It's fascinating. Extreme events, fascinating. Climate science gets us to the front door of the policy house. It tells us, oh, there's some risks here you might want to deal with. When you walk into that policy house, we're going to talk about economics, we're going to talk about energy access, we're going to talk about energy security, energy reliability. In this country, there's a massive increase in electricity demand from data centers, AI, electrification of vehicles. Energy policy is a big issue. Climate change is a part of that. For a long time, energy policy was considered a subset of climate policy. Once people's electricity bills go up, that switches all around. So I love climate science. I think it's important. And for those of you who think climate science is all I need to know to think about energy policy, great. More power to you. But guess what? 85% of your fellow citizens don't think like that. And so when I talk to people about climate and energy policy, I try to talk about that Big Ten.
One more time for Roger Pelkey Jr. and Frank Alcock. Thank you so much. Once again, we have our next event on November 12th, Psychedelics, Healers, and CIA Mind Controllers. We hope to see you there. If you would let Roger Pelkey Jr. and Frank Alcock please go to the exit before. They will be outside, able to chat with you and take some pictures for a little bit before they leave. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate it.